Hey guys, welcome to Braddels Gaming and to another discussion video on the future of Far Cry, specifically what we as the Far Cry community should do now that Far Cry 6 will not include a map editor arcade. This is per Far Cry 6's game director Alexander Latendra, or Alex for short, who on the 1st of June 2021 answered a question during a Far Cry 6 Reddit AMA about if the map editor would be returning to Far Cry 6. As you can see from the screenshot on your screens now, Alex fundamentally declines the return of this feature in Far Cry 6, and this is something that I actually break down in my last discussion video, including an analysis of what I believe the impacts and ramifications of this decision by Ubisoft will have on Far Cry 6 towards the company, the community, and the game itself. But today's video, as the title suggests, is all about how we as the Far Cry community can bring Ubisoft back to the Far Cry 5 arcade. Now, because there are seemingly no plans on the horizon for Ubisoft to either introduce a map editor into Far Cry 6 at a later date, or to develop a standalone free-to-play Far Cry map editor arcade game, it seems we as the Far Cry community will be sticking around with the Far Cry arcade for much longer than originally anticipated. And yet I don't think this is that much of a dilemma, because the Far Cry 5 arcade still remains largely operational. There's still heaps of creators around the world producing amazing new free content for players to experience every day. And whilst the technology of the Far Cry 5 arcade might not be the latest, I feel there isn't too much of a difference in the technology from 2018 to 2021. Now I know this next example is a bit extreme, but you only have to look as far as Cyberpunk 2077 released in September 2020 to see that even in games such as this, with so much hype, promise, potential and a game developer that prior to the release of Cyberpunk had such a high reputation, shows us that in the gaming world there is often no correlation between how good a game is based on how long ago it was released. Now let's get straight into the idea at hand, and that's simply a plea for people, specifically the Far Cry community, to come back to the Far Cry 5 arcade, and ideally, Ubisoft will follow. Whilst I acknowledge that a big thing stopping people from revisiting the Far Cry 5 arcade is that it's no longer being updated and supported by Ubisoft, I want to point everyone's attention to a moment in gaming history when a collective player base, indirectly, swayed a AAA game developer to return to a game that had otherwise stopped releasing new updates for, even if it was just a once-off. In April 2019, a full year after the release of Far Cry 5 and 7 months since the last update for Far Cry 5, update 1.11 in September 2018, Ubisoft released a new update for Far Cry 5, update 1.12, which was brought into the game to fix a few minor graphical issues after an increase in the activity on Far Cry 5 following new interest in the game because of Far Cry 5's direct sequel Far Cry New Dawn releasing. This is a monumental milestone to mark down because it shows a time where the Far Cry fanbase, indirectly, convinced a AAA game developer such as Ubisoft to return to a game it had otherwise stopped releasing new updates for, just on the basis of a spike in player numbers. The only difference I'm proposing is that this spike in player numbers on Far Cry 5 becomes something that we as the Far Cry community do intentionally and directly over the next 6 months for the following purposes. That 1, it will hopefully inspire a large contingent of people to return to the arcade, strengthening the player counts and returning them to soon after release post-launch numbers, which will make the game's player base much more dynamic again, as more people will not only be experiencing maps, but possibly creating them as well. 2. Show Ubisoft that we, the Far Cry community, want to see the map editor and arcade mode continue to be a big part of the Far Cry franchise's plans for the future. In other words, show them that we are united on this front. And 3. Possibly bring Ubisoft back to the Far Cry 5 arcade, with the goal that they will again release new updates for the game in the form of new map editor content and bug fixes that we as creators can utilize to make our maps play and feel more dynamic than with the tools we currently possess. This will mean that until Ubisoft makes concrete plans for the map editor and arcade mode to return again in a future Far Cry game, the Far Cry community will at least have a valuable short to medium term substitute to fill the current void behind the creative aspect of Far Cry that will now likely be absent for an extended period of time. If Ubisoft comes back to the Far Cry 5 arcade, we as the Far Cry community will again be able to have our creative map building and custom map playing urges fulfilled. Now I say 6 months because there is the possibility that Ubisoft could ignore this even if we were to pull it off due to Far Cry 6's near release. They might internally argue amongst themselves that there's only a spike in player numbers in Far Cry 5 because people are excited about the upcoming release of Far Cry 6 and therefore not come back to Far Cry 5 to support it. A 6-month window, whilst extremely ambitious, would extend long after the release of Far Cry 6, all the way into February of next year, and given Far Cry 6 will have very limited ability for people to interact with each other because there will be no arcade mode for them to interact with each other in the first place, this 6-month window would show Ubisoft the benefit of having an arcade mode even more, due to how much longevity is produced from having an arcade mode in their Far Cry games. Now, there is a counter argument to this that we don't need it to be a 6-month window because they'd be able to see that the player counts for Far Cry 5 were high on the arcade as opposed to the campaign, and therefore they might also internally argue amongst themselves, hey, maybe we should return to the Far Cry 5 arcade. Either way, I only see positivity out of this scenario. But as is always the case with anything, to make this happen, we, the community, need to be the catalyst for this change. Now I want to finish the video off with a few disclaimers. One, I am not necessarily saying that if every Far Cry fan jumped back on Far Cry 5 this week, or even over the 6-month period that I mentioned above, that Ubisoft will come back to this game and start releasing new updates and content again. But what I am definitely saying is that what this may do is change Ubisoft's perception of the arcade and its multifaceted potential that everybody I've seen or played with in the Far Cry community seems to understand, but somehow not Ubisoft itself. 2. Logistically, it's going to be extremely difficult for myself to spread this idea around and to gather enough people that are willing to go through with this idea, but regardless, I still wanted to share it because personally I think this is a great indirect and innovative method we can use to convey to Ubisoft I want to see the arcade mode return to the Far Cry franchise, whether this be in the form of a standalone Far Cry map editor arcade game in the near future, or as I've already reiterated throughout this video, for Ubisoft to come back to Far Cry 5 and release new free map editor content and bug fix updates for it again. They could even do this in the form of a small dedicated development team coming back to Far Cry 5 to release these new updates. And number 3, sharing this idea I felt was critical because as a massive Far Cry fan, I want to see Far Cry succeed and not plummet. And while some of my words in this video might seem a little harsh on Ubisoft, I genuinely do respect them as a game developer, as they produce so many memorable experiences for myself as a gamer and person. With all that being said though, I do hope somehow that this video miraculously blows up so this idea can become fruition. So come on YouTube algorithm, do it for the sake of Far Cry. And to everyone watching the video, I want to implore you all to jump back on the Far Cry 5 arcade, give it the love it deserves, and maybe, just maybe, Ubisoft will come back to support it again, and also start making plans for this feature to again become a staple of its franchise. Now before I get into the channel update, I just want to quickly comment on the 2 maps that are being featured in the background of this video. 2 very distinct multiplayer maps that are both super fun and unique in their own crazy creative ways. The first one is an insane Far Cry map concept based on the classic strategy and chance game Battleships. This is Battleship DWXX created by Death Weapon XX, and I have to admit that it's probably the first multiplayer map I've played in the arcade where the modders are actually respectable killing machines and not just there for show. So great job to Death Weapon on figuring this one out, and committing to a map concept that I'm sure mightn't have even been worth it, especially if the use of the modders didn't end up working out. Great problem solving, persistence, and real creativity to create such an aesthetically pleasing and refreshing gameplay approach to a map in the Far Cry arcade. So big shout out to the creator Death Weapon XX, and although this isn't a formal community creations episode, definitely check this map out on your respective platform for an absolute blast, pun intended. Now switching over to the next map, we have Gladiator Arena, created by Pelican470, an Xbox friend of mine. This second map is a take on the Coliseum Killing Arena maps you may have played on the arcade before, but this one's a little different because it doesn't follow the traditional formula of a Coliseum map that's played out in a circular stadium. Instead, this one looks more like it's based in an Egyptian stronghold and favours more rocky, uneven terrain, which really separates this map from the other arena style maps on the arcade, which are generally more flat. This makes the gameplay so much more dynamic, and you'll see lots of moments in the gameplay where iconic Gladiator-esque and Far Cry-esque jump takedowns took place. So, if you're up for some combat melee style, be sure to give this one a go as well. Finally, I wanted to share with you all what's next for the channel now that there'll be no map editor in Far Cry 6. As you can probably tell, I'm still very emotionally invested in Far Cry 5, and as a result I'm still going to be playing the game and producing content for it, even if at this stage it is an irrelevant game to cover. But because my main passion for Far Cry 5 is around the map editor and the arcade, creating my own maps and also experiencing others' amazing creations, this game still remains very much relevant to me. And of course it has the chance to become even more relevant should the community make it so by following through with the main idea I discussed in the video. The Far Cry 5 community creation series is now going to continue long into the future, which I think is great, as Far Cry 6's disappointing news opens up the very positive opportunity for me to highlight creators' maps I've played on that I haven't yet been able to feature on this channel, but would absolutely love to. These creators definitely deserve to be recognized and rewarded for all of their creativity and hard work they put into the map editor, as they have created some truly awesome experiences for other gamers such as myself to indulge in. Likewise, the series where I feature my own custom maps won't be going away anytime soon either. Now, way back in my Far Cry 6 pre-reveal gameplay thoughts video, I emphasized that a new playlist called the Far Cry 6 Discussion Videos playlist would be coming to the channel, but with the admission that there will be no sort of arcade mode or map editor coming to Far Cry 6, I had to slightly alter the name of this playlist from Far Cry 6 Discussion Videos to the much juicier The Future of Far Cry Discussion Videos title. This will give me more scope as a creator to produce discussion videos at my own leisure, as opposed to becoming a channel that just reports on the latest news from Far Cry 6, as I know there will already be an abundance of people doing. There's also no point making any discussion videos around topics related to Far Cry 6, given the game releases in under 2 months' time. You can therefore expect the future of Far Cry discussion videos to be more of a suggestive or speculative nature as opposed to directly informative or reportive, as anything beyond Far Cry 6 at this stage is probably years away, although I still see the value of doing these now, as it will hopefully motivate others to continue to share their own ideas about what future direction Ubisoft should take the Far Cry franchise, so Ubisoft themselves can feel supported by the community in knowing what types of products we want to see from them. On a side note, I think we'll have a much better chance of seeing a product similar in nature to the rumoured Far Cry Frenzy game, and most importantly, a fully fleshed out product, if we start suggesting things we want to see in a game like this to Ubisoft now, rather than later. So to summarize, the bulk of my channel will continue to have Far Cry 5 content front and center, but will also feature the Future of Far Cry discussion videos series. But that wraps up this discussion video on how the Far Cry community can bring Ubisoft back to the Far Cry 5 arcade, and a short update on the channel moving forward. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please consider liking the video and subscribing and hitting the bell icon if you're new around here, as there will be a big bunch of new Far Cry content coming your way very soon. Tell me what you think of this idea. Are you behind it? Do you think it's possible or completely unrealistic? Whatever your opinion is, whether it's to do with this idea on Far Cry 6, the fact that there will be no map editor in Far Cry 6, or what you think is next for the Far Cry franchise, please feel free to drop it down below and spark some discussion. But otherwise, I'm Braddels Gaming, I'm signing out now, and remember to have yourselves a great day.